If you're enjoying the Cowboy Crossroads podcast and would like to help me keep it going, you can become a patron over at Patreon. Patreon is a platform that allows you to offer monthly support to creative endeavors that you enjoy, and in exchange for that support, you get access to some exclusive content. I actually just put up an exclusive episode of the podcast with today's guest, Andy Wilkinson, where he goes in depth on the stories behind the songs and poems on his album, Charlie Goodnight, His Life in Poetry and Song. You can check that out and become a patron at patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. That's patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. I'd like to start this show with a poem written by today's guest, Andy Wilkinson. This piece is entitled J.B. Allen, Dragon Calves. At the Wagon. The last dregs of darkness we drained like the coffee we drank at the wagon before riding out, with coat collars turned to the wind-riven clouds, our breath on the morning laid heavy and frosty in damp conversations and well-muffled shouts. The young punchers joking, the old talking weather, our spur music quieted down by the wind, our cow ponies restless, the day to begin. The last pasture waiting like time for the gather, for spreading and starting the big circle in. Jack and R.W. and J.B. and Jeremy and Alan and Deward and Charles and I, we paired off then set off o'er earth under sky, singing horizons and cowpuncher melody to rhythms of riders, to riders gone by. We were the horsemen. We loped across sand hills and stuck to the ridges to survey the blowouts, then slowed to a trot, to crack through the brush and the cottonwood mottes, through scrub in the bottom of each of the washes, where hunkered the wild ones, where rangy ones got to sidestep the circle our riding was weaving, and stay free, like we felt that we ourselves were, bound only by cowpunching's practical spur to be in the right place, the right time, and leaving the rest of the world to kowtow with yes sir and no sir, and worry the measured opinion of people who were not our equals in things of the land and the sky and all that such brings. For we were the horsemen, and we held dominion in northern New Mexico, branding in spring. Back to the pens. The square pasture rounded, the cattle encircled, we pointed 'em back to the pens by the mill, for unfinished work isn't time standing still, and dawn had turned morning, the sun turning purple, the sage and the clouds and the tops of the hills, then purple to gold while the shadows grew shorter, so we pressed 'em on tightly bunched in a trot until we could spill 'em out into the lot, milling and balling, separated then sorted, the propane sputtering, the irons getting hot. Jack divvied the work up, the tough hands dehorning, the flanking to greenhorns whose breeches were clean, to youngsters ear-notching and dishing vaccine, the skillful to cutting, Jack keeping his branding, bestowing the dragon like crowning a king. Turning the pages. J.B. worked the pen without using a bridle, a string lightly slung around the neck of his horse, his gelding responding to touch without force. If smooth was a contest, that horse took the title, flowing through cattle like a river its course. J.B. roped his calves out to drag to the flankers, like turning the page in a book on his lap. No community loop, he just laid a trap, then pulled 'em like notes being called in by bankers, as slick as the creases on worn leather chaps. We jerked the last loop off the last calf, while J.B. sat in his saddle like a good line of verse he had written, straight up and easy and terse, like branding is poetry. Surely, oh surely, there's things might be better, but most things are worse. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy west and beyond. My guest today is Andy Wilkinson. Andy Wilkinson is a poet, a songwriter, a playwright, and a storyteller. He also teaches creative process at Texas Tech University, where he oversees creative projects. In 1985, Andy won the New Folk Songwriters Contest at the Kerrville Folk Festival, and in 2014, he was inducted into the West Texas Walk of Fame. Along the way, he's won 5 Wrangler Awards from the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. Andy produced my first album of music back in 2004, and we've since collaborated on 4 albums together. I consider him a close friend and an important mentor. Andy has been a previous guest on 2 episodes of Cowboy Crossroads, telling stories and discussing the life and importance of his distant uncle, Charlie Goodnight. If you haven't already listened to those, I'd recommend checking them out on episodes 28 and 29. I sat down with Andy at my dining room table at my home in Lubbock, Texas, to record this interview. I began by asking Andy how he grew to appreciate the Llano Estacado, the place that we both call home. Here's Andy Wilkinson.
Right, and of course, essentially, that's what this whole book is about. Is how does that happen? And the short answer is you don't know exactly when it happens, and you may not even know it happened until you look back on it. And for me, part of that was like everybody, when you're in the forest, you see the trees, and you don't think about it being a forest until you're out of it, and then you look back and go, "Oh, that's a forest." I see it in a different way now. Well, when I moved off in 1973 to Colorado and was there for 6 years, I recognized something was very unique about the place I came from. I was not only moving to the front range of the Rocky Mountains, which was where the plains ends, this place that we live on here. Our part of the plains, called the Llano Estacado, but it's just one part of the plains. And not only was I moving to that front range of the Rocky Mountains, I was moving from a city then of, I don't know how big we were, probably 200,000, not as big as we are now, but still about the same size. But I was moving to a metropolitan area, Denver and the suburbs, which was, 1 million people. In total, Denver itself, I think, was 500,000, maybe a third of that. So there was a big difference, in going from here to there, and living away from the place I'd grown up in, which was another thing. So that gave me a way to look back, and then since my wife and I's family were all back here, and not long after we moved up there, we had our son, and we had the only grandbaby on either side. So we spent a lot of time going back and forth. So it was like an opportunity, or opportunity sounds like, getting a chance to do something. It was not quite so much an opportunity, but an activity that allowed me to look at this place in a different way. And then to also recognize that the people that I was working with and meeting, I was in police work. I'd been in police work before I left, and I was in police work there. So I was in a job where you see people oftentimes, most often, at their worst, not at their best. So you always make allowances for that, but still they were different people there. They were still people of the West, but they were different people than they were here. So I began to see some differences, and I'd already begun writing some songs. I wrote my first song when I was in the second grade. It was terrible. And I didn't write all that much till I was a senior in high school, and I started writing songs again. I got a guitar, and I was writing some poems and songs. But when I got up to Colorado, now in Lubbock, after I got out of high school, I was working on the police department at night and going to college during the day, so I didn't have a lot of time to do a lot of things, but I wrote some poems. I didn't write that many songs. But when I got up to Colorado, I played the guitar more, and I started writing a few more songs. But then we moved back in 1979. I decided I'd had a really good career. I was a police lieutenant. I hadn't been for 4 years, and I was a young man to had that much progression in that business. But I also recognized that I could be a lieutenant for another 10 years and still be a young man in that job. And I didn't want to do it. And besides, I wanted to do some different things. I wanted to play music. I wanted to write. I wanted to paint. All those things were very difficult to do as a policeman, particularly music, One of the things I really hated about police work was that I was obligated ethically and actually legally by my job to be armed every time I left my house, I had to carry a gun all the time. Now, all these people who want to carry guns today, I think, man, you don't know what a burden that is. Don't wish it on yourself, or don't go out and seek it. I thought, there's more to life than doing that, and I could see what my career path was going to be. I was going to wind up getting a job as a police chief in a small town. Then I'd get another job as a police chief in a little bit larger town, and that's how it would work, and because that's how it worked in the business back in those days. And I didn't want to do it. I'd been in a doctoral program at the University of Denver in sociology of organizations with a minor in statistics and methodology. And I'd already decided I didn't want to go through and get a PhD because, I thought there was a lot of politics in city government and police work until I got on a university campus and saw that there was probably more politics in that work than there was even in being a cop. So I thought, well, maybe I can actually make it as a musician. But I had a chance to come back here and go to Lubbock and go to work with my dad, who was moving his company from Dallas back to Lubbock. He was a broker of cottonseed meal and hulls and oil, D-high, alfalfa, that kind of stuff. And so I met Bill Blackwood, the bass player, and the singer, and so we played as a duet, and we played in places around here, and then we finally got a band together, and I was writing a lot more songs, and I got accepted to the New Folk, a New Folk contestant in 1983, and in 1985 I was a New Folk winner, which at Kerrville, and that was a big deal, and that kind of got me going. So then I put together enough stuff to do an album and started recording at Caldwell Studios with Lloyd Maines producing me. Got a 9-song demo together and sent it out to Nashville. I had a contact that with a publishing company out there that after some dickering around, we signed a deal, and he got, it was really funny, he got a hold put on 2 of those songs by Waylon Jennings, which at the time was a big deal. Waylon was huge. And Waylon's comment to my agent at the time was, well, if I don't do these, I'm going to give them to Johnny. And he meant Johnny Cash, which would have been another huge deal, And so the problem with that was, it made me feel good, but the problem was my rep with the publishing company was so excited about it, he didn't do anything else to pitch any of the tunes. He just sat back and waited for Waylon to cut them, and Waylon never did,
Which 2 songs were those?
It was Texas, When Texas Was Free, and Another Man's Words. I think Waylon liked Another Man's Words best. That was the one that he preferred. But and it was a funny story because now in Waylon's defense, although probably is still not defensible, and you'll understand that in the rest of the story. But he had a heart attack the next year. The first of the series of heart attacks he had. So he didn't record the songs, and I only had a 2-year deal with the publisher who had wanted a lifetime contract with me, which was, of course, that was crazy to do. And so we wound up negotiating it down to 2 years. And Waylon never cut him during those 2 years, and so the deal expired, and we went on our separate ways. But several years after that, I had become friends with Sonny Curtis. Sonny was in Meta, staying with his dad to visit, but had a little gig to do down in Odessa, a house concert. And so he asked if I'd drive him. So I picked him up, and we drove down from Meta to Odessa, which was a really fun trip. It was summertime. Of course, we were traveling country that, as a young boy, a teenager, that Sonny had worked with his dad on their farm, driven tractor. And so it was kind of a neat thing for him. But so I was telling him my story about, because he asked me, why aren't you getting some of these things cut? And I said, well, here's the story. I had this hold put on him by Waylon. And he said, now, wait a minute. Waylon put a hold on him, but he never cut him, did he? And I said, no. And he said, man, he's known for that. He was like, if you're the big university, you sign all the good pitchers for your baseball team so nobody else will get them. You're not going to play them all, but you don't want anybody else getting them. And that's kind of what Waylon was known for. And he told me this story about he and J.I. Allison, when they were rooming together in California. J.I. wrote a song and sent it, wound up, Waylon got a look at it and said, I'm going to cut that, I'm going to put a hold on that for me. I'm going to cut that. Well, same thing happened to J.I. Never got the song cut, and it went over like 2 years. And finally, at the end of a year and a half or so, Sonny said J.I. was just so pissed he could hardly stand it, And if you know J.I. any, J.I. has got a bit of a temper. And so Sonny said he sat down and wrote this 3 or 4 page letter typed in single space on both sides of the page, sent it to Waylon in Nashville, and it basically said, we're friends. We've known each other forever. I've had chances to get this song cut. You put a hold on it. I saved it for you, and now nobody's going to cut it, and you hadn't cut it, And so Sonny's part of the story, my favorite part was, he said, however long it takes a letter to get from L.A. to Nashville, I got a telegram back from Waylon, and the telegram said, Hoss, forget the song, I'm going to cut the letter. So I thought, man, that's great. Well, not long after that, Waylon comes to do this festival in Littlefield named in his honor. And so they put him up at the Holiday Inn that was on the Loop, the Pyramid Plaza. And I happened to be playing happy hour in the bar in the atrium. So I'm up there singing along, being ignored by everybody at the bar, which is what happens at happy hour. And I see way back in the back of the bar, which is easy to see because it's this sunlit atrium, I see Waylon Jennings come in and sit down. He sits down with his back to me, but it's Waylon Jennings. Obviously, there's not many places to stay in Littlefield, and so he was staying at that hotel. So as soon as I finished the song I was doing, I sang those 2 songs in a row. At the end of the second one, which was Another Man's Words, Waylon turned around, looked at me, and raised his beer. Turned back to what he was doing. Never came up and said anything. That was the extent of it. When I got back here, it was plainly obvious to me that being back here had turbocharged my writing. Poetry, songs, both. That reconnecting with the place I grew up in was essential to writing something that was true, for me. Didn't have anything to do with was I better at writing a stanza or a verse or a chorus or a bridge or none of that. I mean, that technical stuff was all pretty much the same. But the substance of what I was writing about was fundamentally different and much, much better. And that's when it all started coming together for me that there's a reason that works better out here, and that's because this is a place that shaped me into who and what I am. And so my job is to put that in words and music. And not long after that, not long, it was 10 years after I came back, before I quit my day job and started doing music full time, which is a very scary thing. Not any way to have a plan of action, There's so much, just like the story I related about Waylon, so much of that is fate, I've won some great awards for stuff that I'm surprised I won an award for. Some other stuff I've done that I think should have been award material didn't merit an award. How do you know? The Dixie Chicks cut a recording of one of my songs, and at the same time that they, right afterwards, they got into their big fight with Sony Records, and Sony put that album that song was on in the can, and it's never seen the light of day. Well, that would have been a huge break back then because they were really big. Those little things can work against you or for you or not have any effect at all. So you can't make a plan based on that. So what I did was I came up with this idea based on the readings I'd done about how native peoples traversed the Llano, long about the time of Coronado, because that's when we have records of it. So 500 years ago, how did they find their way around? There are no landmarks. There are no hills. There are no trees. There's no little depressions here and there, but it's really not much, especially from a distance, that you can see. So they had, and this in particular were the Indians called it Teos. Not the Teos that Texas comes from, but a different group that was out here on the plains. Some people think they're the same as the Plains Apache, but I don't know. But what they would do in the morning when they would get up from camp and the sun came up, they would see where the shadows were cast, and they knew where the sun was coming up from, and they knew which way they wanted to go. So at that moment, they would literally shoot an arrow in the direction they wanted to go. And as they approached, when they started out, as they approached that arrow, they would shoot another one over the top of it. And so by doing that, they leapfrogged, these arrows as a way to get a straight line. And I thought, that's kind of the way I have to think about myself. And so my arrow was, what do I want to look like in 5 years from now, or 2 years, or 10 years? And one of those things was, I want, when people think about this place, the first person they think about as the bard or balladeer of this country is me. And when they think about me, the first thing I want them to think about is, oh, he's the guy that writes about this country. So that was the arrow I was shooting at, or shooting over. That was sort of my plan. That's what I've been working on ever since. The other thing was that if you've got that arrow going over the other arrow, and something happens over to one side or the other, do you change your direction, go after that thing on either side? And my answer was, no, you don't. And so I passed up some business opportunities that would have made a lot of money. But if I'd taken them, I thought at the time, and I'm quite sure, thinking back on it, I'd have more money, although it would have been spent by now. But would I've ever gotten back to that same path? I don't know. I doubt it. Maybe so, but I doubt it.
What kind of practical things did you do to shoot that first arrow?
Well, I wrote, and I tried to play. I had friends giving me advice on things to do. Sonny Curtis, here's a guy that wrote "I Fought the Law" and the Law Won. He wrote the theme song for the Mary Tyler Moore Show. He wrote, I think at that time he may not have had a cut yet on "I'm No Stranger to the Rain," but More Than I Can Say, which was a huge hit, It was a pop hit as well as a country hit, and a hell of a song. I just think a great songwriter, great guitar player, wonderful human being. And this was great advice. He said, when I show up with a song in one of those offices in Nashville, they don't think I'm any more useful to them than if you show up. And they don't even know you. All they're wanting to know is what's happening now and what's going to happen next. Not what I've done, not, my status or my achievements, but what's going on now. And that was real sobering to think about, But it was also liberating. When you're a songwriter, you don't think about the people right around you. One of the sad things about what's going on in Lubbock now is that everybody's saying, well, who's the best songwriter in Lubbock? Well, that doesn't amount to a hill of beans. When I write a song, my competition is Stephen Foster, it's Bob Dylan, it's Hoagie Carmichael, it's Mick and Keith of the Rolling Stones, it's Lennon McCartney. Those are your competitors. Those are songwriters, and those are songs that are out there. And if you think that you're competing at a lesser level, or you should be competing at a lesser level, you should give it up, because the song is a much bigger life. And so the fact that Sonny would say something like, "I'm no more important than you are," that was scary in one way, because you realize, well, if I have a hit, or I won the songwriter award in my hand, that is useless to you. But on the other hand, it doesn't matter. If you got a good song, you're just as important as anybody else. And so that's a liberating thing to think about. If I have a good song, I'm as good as anybody else.
In a song entitled "The Poet's Catch-Rope," Andy Wilkinson wrote these words about his friend Buck Ramsey. He was a cowboy of the Texas plains, a prairie prince who from his saddle reigned over a grassy fiefdom. Yet he yearned to hear the voices singing Robert Burns. Oh, 'twas hard to steal the hoorah and the shout until the poet's catch-rope caught him out.
I got interested in the cowboy culture movement and met Buck at the same time. And I got interested because I went to the first cowboy gathering here in Lubbock, which at the time was a good event. It was held at Texas Tech. They had scholars, they had artists, writers, musicians, people from the culture who were ranchers, who were cowpunchers, who were people like Buck, who were singers and poets. I had a lot of friends that were out there, and I was already writing on the Goodnight work because he's my relative, and I'd already started the research, and I was already beginning to write some of those songs and poems that later became that album. So at that first gathering that I attended, I was knocked out by, first of all, the honesty of the work I was hearing. And I was also very, very much taken by the fact that this was all acoustic. It was like a folk club of the 50s, only it was in the 90s. And I was already, in that first couple of records, I was already writing things that fit, the stories like Angels Can Do No More and things like that. And so it wasn't a big leap to think about performing, in those kinds of venues. And then I met Buck, and so he invited me, like Buck always did. He said, "Well, come on up. I can stay in the house, and Betty will cook for you." Of course, Betty didn't know that, but so I went up and I walked into Buck's went up to hear him play on Her Majesty's Service, OHMS, in Amarillo, in the basement of that bank building. I got over there and helped. It's my first time to hang out with Buck, but there were a couple of old cowpunchers there with him. One was Rooster Morris's uncle, and the other one was G.M. Ford. Both of them were ex-cons. Rooster's uncle who's a bootmaker and a good one. Well, he had some beautiful boots on that night, but he hadn't been out of the joint very long. I think stealing cattle. But they were friends of Buck's, and Buck had cowboyed with them, when he was younger. And so I helped the two of them get Buck up and down the stairs, and that. And Buck said, "Come on over to the house." So, I didn't stay the night with him. I drove back to Lubbock. But I went over to his house, and he said, "Here's my study. We can sit in here." And so we sat down in his study, and I looked at his bookshelves, and I'll bet 2/3 of the books in his shelves were the same damn books that I had in my shelves. And I said, we're connecting in a way that neither one of us understand yet, but it wasn't long before we both got that same thing, that we were interested in the same philosophy. We had the same philosophy on life, and we were reading the same things. We had the same interest in literature and poetry. And plus, by this time, I hadn't quit my day job yet, but I wasn't far from it. And so the minute I quit, Buck knew about that, and so I'd get a call from him, wanting to know if could I take off a week and drive him to, wherever. So we started spending time together, and there's no better education other than being on the back of a horse, but it would take you a lot more years on the back of a horse to get the same education you get out of riding a few miles with Buck. And a lot less, well, I wouldn't say a lot less trouble. Maybe that's not true, but you didn't get saddle sore. And then going to the first Elko was it was life-changing. It was like going to the first time I went to Kerrville. I mean, it was the very same thing, just a different set of music, but the same kind of people. In those years, they were diverse racially. They didn't have many black cowboys at the time, but you had Mexican American cowboys. You had Hank and other Native American cowboys. You had women, and you had people who came from all level of experience as writers and as singers. And again, there's that same honesty and that same devotion to the underlying thread that was just exactly the same way it was at Kerrville. And this was Kerrville in the mid-'80s when I was active there. It's very different than, I think, the Kerrville of today. Not long after that, in the 90s, I got invited back to Kerrville to do a program. I took Lloyd and Kenny and Latranda with me, and we did some sets together. I remember that. But someone asked me, "Well, what do you think about this modern crop of singer-songwriters?" And the only thing I could think to say was, they really play good guitar. But their songs, they were all internal. They were emo. It was pop schlock, only with an acoustic veneer. And it wasn't like that in the 80s. In the 80s, there was still a real folk spirit to it that was reminiscent, probably the very first Kerrville. It was quite different. Well, Elko was the same way. And there was such a diversity there. That was the other thing I liked. Two people with completely different backgrounds, completely different politics, completely different ideas about religion, completely different in every other way, could sit down at Elko and be friends and have a discussion sometimes about their differences. More often it was about the things that they found the same, together. And there was the word gets overused, but a fellowship that was pretty remarkable, in those first gatherings I went to, and really for a long time. And because I was there with Buck, I was accepted right away. And the fact that my uncle was Charlie Goodnight, so I had two pluses going for me. That was the involvement in that. And then making the friends that I made through that, we started that gathering at Narravisa, which it was also a beautiful thing at the beginning. Buck's famous letter, "No stars need apply," and the pay was based on how far you had to travel to get there. We divided up the gate, and people closest got the least amount of money, and the people from furthest away got the most. And it was just a very unique thing. And I heard some performances from people then that were just over the top, and I heard them years after and in different places, and they weren't that good. They just did well when they were in that environment. And that was an interesting thing to see, too. I think the same thing could be said for Elko, especially when I first started going out there, that people performed above their abilities. There was something about the place and the time and the other people that the energy fed. One thing fed another. It was pretty remarkable to see that happen.
In the foreword to a book of Red Stegall poems and Skeeter Hagler photographs, Andy Wilkinson wrote this about the creative process. Art is a process, not a product. It's a distinction we forget, if ever we knew it, because we witness the work of art only rarely. Most often we attend the artist's temporary respite in things called paintings or symphonies, dances or sculptures, poems or photographs. Long before we are done with our surprise, our satisfaction, our bartering and selling and collecting, the artist is back in the saddle cutting sign for the next camp. For these evidences of art are not end results, but markers on a trail of exploration. They are not answers, but questions. They are not statements, but suppositions.
Well, it's always a process. I mean, if you ever think that you're through that process, you're through. One of the things I mentioned just a few minutes ago was that as a songwriter, your competitor is not the person in the band with you or in the other band that's across the street. Your competitors are the greats, the timeless songwriters. That's where you have to be. And it's the same when you write. I was reading some prose earlier. How do you learn to write? Well, the first thing you do is you learn to read. And when you're going to write songs, the first thing you better do is start listening to songs. And you got to listen to the songs, not just the singer. Mick Jagger said it's the singer, not the song. Well, that's true if you're becoming a hit, but the song itself is the core of it. The other thing is that whether you have a good voice or you're a good guitar player or you're a good arranger or you're handsome or you're whatever, those are all things that come and go. And not only that, there's somebody out there that's got more of that than you got. You can't turn over a rock in Lubbock, Texas without 2 or 3 great guitar players popping out from under it. People who can play their asses off and play circles around most anybody on the planet. And next time you turn around, they'll be back under that rock because it takes more than that to be famous. There's those things on the outside. They can obscure that internal thing to people who aren't of serious main or who aren't analysts of what's going on. But those are not the people you're writing for anyway. First of all, you're writing to make sure, for yourself, to make sure you do the best you can. But you're not trying to impress those people who are going along skimming the surface. You're trying to impress the people, or not impress, but you want to be recognized by the people who understand a good song, who hear a lot of them. So when my friend Lloyd Main says, that's a good song, man, that is what I want to hear. And there's a guy who produces so many great performers and great writers. And for him to say, that's a great song, that's that's better than any award. You have to be listening to good songs, and then you have to be analytical about it. So you have this, like I've been teaching in my creative process classes now for right at 20 years. Process is the most important thing. The product will take care of itself. And the process is a balancing between intuition and analysis. So you hear a good song and you know it when you hear it. But if that's all you do is say, oh, that's a great song, and you don't think about why is it a great song, how does it work, then you're never going to be a very good songwriter. There are some great songs that could be just so much better, but still they're great. And so you think, how would I know how I'd fix that song to make it the best song it could ever be. But what about it, even despite all the problems that it has, makes it so good that you have to listen to it? And one of the things that helped me, I think, was growing up in the 60s. We haven't had a time in American music. We haven't had a time in music that we know of in the world that was as fertile as that time from the late 50s through about the mid 70s. There's about 20 years there where we had folk music. You had folk music who people were not only rediscovering things, but also people like Bob Dylan who were writing things. You had rock and roll, which was incredibly inventive at the time. The Beatles, the Stones, the Animals, the Who. That album Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys. 409 and Surfing USA, all that pop stuff we listened to when I was in junior high. Here comes this album, Pet Sounds, that is just phenomenal. It's just the kind of thing that how did they do that? It's like Sgt. Pepper. These things that were just, they were so new and so different. And even today when I listen back to them, I still feel that freshness. That is the mark of a really good piece of work. It keeps its edge. During the pandemic, I've been doing a lot of reading, and because I had time. I can read the good writers like Hemingway. I can read D.H. Lawrence. I can read those people, and you still see the faults in it, especially looking back on it from stuff that was written in the 1920s and the 1940s and the 1950s. You can see the faults, but there's still that core essence that is so fresh and so bright and so stimulating. And you think that if I want to write, I have to see what it is that makes those things work that way. It's the same with the song. What makes it work?
Andy Wilkinson is currently working on a memoir about his years growing up in West Texas, and he was gracious enough to share a couple of passages with me here on the podcast.
Like the tones and hues in a well-executed oil painting or watercolor or pencil sketch, the outward and inward Llano weren't separated by hard lines, but blended one into the other across soft edges. Every dust storm came in as a high roller, most always from the west, the wind sharply defined and visible at first, making itself known to the eye long before the nose and mouth and skin and ears knew about it. The base layers dark and roiling, the boiling middle layers a lighter brown or reddish, the almost airy and feathery tops not even layers, all the remaining hard edges disappearing when the high roller hit, engulfing you and everything around you, filling up the air outside and inside too before it left, the leaving often taking several days, even then leaving only grudgingly by degrees. Blue northers were the same, beginning as an indigo line close to the horizon in the north or the northwest, sometimes rolling in the same way as the dusters, but more often simply growing and growing until it engulfed you, and always with more and fiercer wind than the high rollers. The blue wind of the northers, strong and persistent and able to blow fine snow into the cracks and crevices of the barracks. The wind-driven cold, bitter and penetrating through the walls, eventually departing in like manner to the dusters, though both, high rollers and blue northers the same, having the effect of scrubbing the air itself and the sky that contained it, and so leaving them clear and clean once the storms had departed. Weather dominates. In every city and in every comfortable place, it's easy to forget this truth. Not in any countryside where land work is life work, and certainly not on the Llano Estacado, where new weather can be seen coming 2 days off. The aforementioned dust storms and northers, the easy examples. And where the slow weather of drought and heat wave and cold spell are visible in every single thing on every single day. Thunderstorms and tornadoes were another matter. They always are. No matter that spring through fall, all through the last century, the Llano lay at the foul line of Tornado Alley, so these violent storms were common and frequent and plentiful. Nevertheless, even when conditions favor them, they come unexpected. Clear afternoon skies of a moment sprouting friendly, fluffy cumulus clouds darkening the next moment, thundering the moment after that. It's thundered in the thickets, Mom said out of habit and reflex at the first rumble or clap or boom. The lightning that caused the thunder sometimes just ahead, sometimes just after. We Llaneros wear our weather as we would a crown or a badge of honor or a medal, not in boast and not in pride, but in simple statement that we are who we are owing to our weather. For we are weatheristas. High rollers and blue northers drive what's outward inward, their hard edges blending as they move into and within our spaces, whereas tornadoes and the thunderstorms that spawn them are meteorological mixmasters, swirling the outward and inward together into always exhilarating and sometimes frightening and often terrifying whirling, spiraling eddies of lightning and rain and wind, thundering and roaring and smelling sharply of ozone and sweetly of rain, snake dancing over the flatlands. Tornadoes drive us, we outwards looking Llaneros, drive us inwards into ourselves, first into physical hiding down into storm cellar freight holes to cower inside, fearful of what's stalking us above ground, almost as fearful of the real and imagined eight-legged and no-legged and furry-legged creatures lurking in wait for us below. It's only then we are driven into ourselves, our resolute hearts struggling with our compulsive panic for dominion over our variable courage. The hard edges we drew betwixt the three, with the artificial straight-line borders made from what we thought we knew of the world and what we thought we knew of ourselves. These now had no edges at all. All three mixed into the primal question, will we make it through this? With hope, our only answer. We knew then why the Comanche refused to go underground. I will add that cotton is in every other way beautiful, too, to those of us who feel a kinship to the soil and to the things that grow in it, and to those of us who wear clothing made from its cloth, and to those of us who paint artworks on canvases and panels and papers made from its fibers, and to those of us flying overhead or driving across the Llano in late fall who witness wildly white fields filled with its open bowls at a time of year when all else is dying and dry and sere, its delicate pink and white and yellow blooms of early summer transformed into fantasy fields of marshmallows on the stalk. Some of you will cry foul at my connecting row crops of any kind to the concept of beauty, to the idea of the beautiful, but that is your own cultural bias in full bloom. For none of you knows the truly natural world, the world that existed before the 4 millions of years that we and our ancestral kin have lived on it and in it, changing it the whole time. So for your consideration, I offer you a well-tended cotton field after the first hard freeze of November, that is, to the open eye and to the inclusive aesthetic. As stunning as a stand of aspen on a week, they turn gold. As embracing as a prairie range covered with grasses of buffalo and blue grama. As nostalgic as the wildflowers you plant in your gardens and alongside your highways. Plato may require that beauty prove itself, but I don't, and you shouldn't either.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Andy Wilkinson for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Andy at andywilkinson.org. You can find out more about me and this show at andyhedges.com. If you're enjoying the show and would like to help me keep it going, you can make a donation on the website, or you could become a patron at patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. I'd like to thank my Trail Boss patron, Bob Kelly, for his support of this episode. You could also leave a review and a rating on the iTunes store, or you could simply tell a friend to listen to the show. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.